Welcome to the Hegemon's Ledger. Here we will explain the culture and its impacts on the development. We will not consider the single state or a nation, but we will distinguish overall cultural impacts on the societies, nations for the development. Let's dive right into the explainer. There is the invisible hand that dictates practically everything we do, from how we play and share as kids all the way to how we govern global economies and evaluate human rights. Culture is the silent architect of our behavior. Today, we are going to connect the dots between childhood development, international workforce innovation, and global development policy, just to see how incredibly deep these cultural roots really go. So, how exactly do kids learn what's right and what's wrong? You might think morality and cooperation are just, hardwired into us from birth, right? But as fascinating 2026 Duke University study published in Science Advances asks exactly how we learn to cooperate in the first place. The researchers really wanted to uncover the actual developmental roots of human cooperation, which, by the way, surpasses absolutely all other species in scale. And this brings up a massive, totally fascinating debate. Are we born with universal, hardwired rules of fairness that apply everywhere? Or are we molded entirely by our local social norms? Basically, is there a single normal way to develop, or does our immediate environment just write all the rules for us? Let's move right into our first section. Learning to cooperate the childhood foundations. To actually answer that big debate, the Duke researchers went global. They didn't just look at one group, they tested over 400 kids aged 5 to 13 across 5 wildly diverse societies. We are talking the United States, Canada, Peru, Uganda, and the shore communities in Amazonian Ecuador. They wanted to see how kids growing in drastically different environments handle things like fairness, trust, and honesty. Now, to measure this, researchers used a highly scientific tool. Well, actually, they used Starburst candy, but actually, they had the kids play these simple games to see how willing they were to share or return favors, often at a cost to themselves. And what they found is super interesting. Young kids everywhere start out pretty much the same, mostly self interested, kind of holding their own little candy stash. But as they hit middle childhood, right around ages 8 to 13, their choices begin to strictly align with their local culture. For example, in highly industrialized societies, kids might learn that sharing equally with strangers is the right thing to do. But in resource scarce environments like the shore communities in Ecuador, hoarding those starbursts it actually isn't seen as selfish at all. In fact, minimizing waste and using resources efficiently is literally the moral imperative. They aren't breaking a rule by not sharing, they are perfectly following their society's survival code, which leads us to this incredibly powerful quote from lead researchers Dorsa Emmer. She says there is no culture of development. You cannot take culture out of the developmental process. This fundamentally proves that Western behavior isn't the global default. Cooperation is completely culturally constructed, and kids figure out exactly what kind of behavior makes the most sense for this specific world. Alright, moving to the section 2, culture in the economy from playgrounds to workforce. So, as these children grew up and entered the workforce, those deeply ingrained cultural norms don't just disappear, they actually scale up and shape entire national economies. To understand this macro level impact, which was extensively analyzed in 2025 from Lyceum India Journal of Social Sciences, we need to look at a couple of theoretical frameworks. First is modernization theory. This basically suggests that nations industrialize, and develop economically. They naturally share traditional constraints like rigid gender roles, which enables greater equality in the workforce. It implies that economic growth is what drives cultural shift. On the flip side, we have dependency theory. This perspective argues that developing nations remain trapped in unequal social and economic structures, not because they fail to modernize, but because of structural dependencies and massive global imbalances between developed and developing nations. When you look at how these play out in the real world across different regions, you can really see how cultural norms dictate economic participation, specifically for women. In Western nations, with legal reforms pushing high female labor participation, jump over to sub Saharan Africa, and there is also high participation, but it's mostly informal economies without access to formal capital. East Asia shows trade driven industrialization with high participation, but those rigid workplace cultures can still hinder a woman's advancement. Meanwhile, in South Asia and Middle East, traditional patriarchal structures can significantly limit workforce entry in the first place. The cultural norms we learn early on that absolutely dictate a nation's GDP and its overall productivity. That brings us to section 3. The power of diversity, innovation through friction. Think about this. What happens when you take all these incredibly diverse cultural backgrounds and mix them together in a modern, globalized workforce? Well, according to a major study for the 2018 Reinhard Mann Prize, it isn't always smooth sailing. Homogeneous teams usually have much easier initial communication. Culturally diverse teams, on the other hand, might hit early language barriers or conflict because of differing values. But at this is a huge but overcoming that initial friction ultimately unlocks a massive competitive advantage and significantly higher innovative power. Why does that initial friction unlock such a massive advantage? It's because employees apply the specific unique cultural knowledge they learn as the kids directly to problems. Diverse teams assess and solve challenges from totally different angles. Plus, culturally diverse workers are often way more willing to take risks. In fact, the study found that cultural diversity outperforms other diversity matrices like age or gender specifically when it comes to boosting innovation. The varied problem solving methods we learned on the playground directly fuel risk taking and innovation in the global business today. Alright, let's look at our final section, section 4. Rethinking harmful traditions, the danger of language. Finally, we really have to examine what happens when international policy steps in and attempts to govern, label, or judge the cultural norms of others. This intersection of culture and global policy gets incredibly sensitive. For instance, a major 2017 policy brief by Joint Learning Initiative on Faith and Local Communities, which was funded by UK Aid, strictly critiques how Western development organizations talk about non-Western cultures, leading to a huge shift in the language of global development. The core finding here is honestly pretty stark. They state the term harmful traditional practices creates resistance from communities, which hinder attempts to modify or end the harmful nature of such practices. The researchers are basically warning that coming in and labeling a community's behavior as a harmful traditional practice instantly shuts doors. It totally alienates the local leaders whose cooperation you actually need to create any positive change. We are neutrally reporting the strict critique from grassroots leaders outlined in the brief. They argue this terminology simplistically vilifies non-Western cultures, basically enforcing a Western secular and colonist discourse. Grassroots leaders point out that it creates bias against specific religions, particularly Islam. by framing the modern Western individuals as liberated and traditional religious individuals as oppressed. What more, they argue this language actually makes the reality that these are often fundamental issue of global gender inequality rather than just global traditions. Because of all this resistance, the official policy recommendation is a complete shift in language. The brief advice totally dropping the term harmful traditional practices which targets non-Western cultures and instead naming the actual underlying issue. They recommended using terms like gender based violence or violence against women and girls. This is crucial, right? Because it addresses the root inequalities that exist in literally every society, including Western ones, rather than pointing a finger solely at tradition. It opens doors for actual constructive context appropriate change. So, from kids hearing candy in the Amazon shore communities to how multinational teams innovate, all the way up to the very language used in global development policy, culture is absolutely never invisible. Once you know where to look, it shapes our deepest assumptions about what is right, wrong, and normal. I will leave you with this final thought to ponder. How do your own culture biases shape what you consider the normal way to live, work, and develop? Thanks for joining the Hegemon's Ledger and keep questioning the invisible hand shaping your world.